Hey, Russ Cochran here again with Small Church, and I'm here with James Saben. James, tell us a little background about yourself. You've been a pastor, you've planted a church, youth pastor for a long time, but give us a little bit of your background.
All right, I'll give you the G version. I'll leave out my life before Jesus. But yeah, I was born in New York City. I don't remember living there because it was up until I was 3 years old. My parents moved out of New York City and then moved to the Jersey Shore, and so I grew up a Jersey Shore boy. And that was it. Then from there, went to WVU, where I wrestled and played soccer there. And I met my wife, who was a cheerleader, so I decided I was going to stay. and that was it. Really, it was about that time in college. I'd gotten saved at 19, and then kind of lost my way a little bit. And about 21 and a half, just when I was the legal drinking age, I decided that I wanted to give Jesus heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Amen.
And that was it. And from there, my journey was on an upward trajectory ever since.
And it's also amazing how God seems to use women to get to us men. Isn't that,
Yes,
isn't that awesome?
yes.
Thank God for those godly women.
That's a fact.
So James is now currently a youth pastor in Westover.
Westover, West Virginia.
West Virginia. Just on the other side of the river, Morgantown. And a very successful youth ministry. So I've asked him to talk to us about small churches and the importance of youth in our small churches, and how do you develop that? How do we interact with today's kids? Because they're not the same as we were.
No,
a lot different. So where would you start with that? If you're a small church pastor and you're saying, man, I know we've got to reach this next generation, or the church may be dead.
Yeah. It's going to be hard. I know what I did as a church plant pastor, but it was a little easier for me for my background. I had an education background. I worked with kids my whole life. Even as a church plant pastor, I was still the youth pastor. We were small enough where I did both duties.
And janitor, I'm sure.
Janitor, I set up
absolutely.
chairs, I did the bulletins, I put together the worship slides. I mean, that's part of church planning. But I always had a heart for the youth. That just was my DNA, and it never went away. And like I said, I've worked with youth before I became a church plant pastor. That's kind of what I did first, and then I was called into the ministry and never lost my youth ministry roots really ever. So I kind of been doing youth ministry for over 20 years because of that. But so I did everything. I'm going to say there's going to be some church plant pastors out there, or small church pastors, who that's probably not their DNA, and it's probably not a good idea for them to do both roles, but to find someone who's got a heart for youth first. I would say this for those churches: don't just put someone in a position like that, because that's going to do more damage than it is good. Kids are going to have a bad experience. Parents are going to have a bad experience, and it's just going to do damage. I would sit back, I would pray, I would wait, and I would keep my eyes wide open for those individuals who I believe God does send and who have a passion for the youth. And of course, initially it's going to be a volunteer role. And the hope is that through growth, they'll be able to provide, the steps for, salary, part-time, etc., up until full-time. But that, of course, is down the road. But I would, based on the pastor, some could pull off. Some small church pastors can and do pull off the dual role. I don't think it's ideal, but I think sometimes it works out fine, and God kind of blesses that. But ideally, I'd love to see that small church pastor find someone.
So in today's society, I think a lot of times, too, we look at the youth and the teenagers, and we say, man, we've got to get the next generation going. But in a small church, especially, and I think even in big churches, but in a small church, in a church plant, a church revitalization, those youth could actually be the key for us doing a lot of outreach. Because they know an iPhone or a Samsung or all the technology that we could actually hand that over to them, couldn't we?
Not only that, but they're in the greatest outreach base. It's called the school. In the community, and the sports teams, and their families. And so usually at that time, they're in a place where they're going to know the most people in their lives at one time.
That's good.
You know what I mean? And so they're in they're in that the word evangelism, fine, but for lack of a better word, they're in a place where evangelism is right there, right there before them. I would tell, for me, any church, and this is what we've seen, there's a great book, and if I can recommend to senior pastors, youth pastors, a great book by Kara Powell from the Fuller Institute called Growing Young, and a great book. What it does, it pretty much says they did this kind of research study, and they found, and of course it's scriptural. I'm looking over here at my phone because Scripture tells us the priority for Israel from God. I don't mean to get all biblical.
Biblical's okay.
It says Deuteronomy 11. It says, "You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart," and people know this, and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign in your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you are sitting in your house and when you are waking, etc., etc. And notice all throughout Scripture we see this in the Old Testament, that God reminding Israel, teach these things to the next generation. Obey my commands and teach them to the next generation. And we remember that there were multiple times where Israel forgot to teach it to the next generation. We specifically see that in Judges, and people began to go their own way. And so for the church, God has called the church as a whole to teach these things to the next generation. And I think churches that focus on the gospel, focus on the Great Commission, the gospel, making disciples, and then focus on their youth, on their young people. What we find in that book, Growing Young, and what we see in our experiences is God's blessing is on those churches.
Yeah.
That we see fruitfulness, that we see a church that thrives. I don't want to necessarily talk just about numbers, but I want to talk about health.
Yeah.
Churches are healthy, and they see the big picture of the mission because I believe we're fulfilling what God called us to do as a church.
That's good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So as we wrap up our time here really quick, what is 2 or 3 things that you would say to a small church pastor that's important for him to know about youth today? And we call them their Generation Z now.
Millennials, Gen Z.
What do they need to know about this generation, good or bad, that could really be a positive thing for their church?
Yeah, this generation is against institution, and I guess it's maybe too strong a word, but they're not sure. The Big Brother. They're not at ease with Big Brother. They think he's out to get them. Institution. People in high, strong position, where our generations took security and people who had position and degrees, they're a little weary. They've kind of been burned, or they're jaded already at such a young age, and so they don't have that trust. They want transparency. They want genuineness from their leaders. Does that make sense?
So really, what that lends to is we want relationship.
Yes.
And that's awesome.
And that's how we're wired. That's the nature of our triune God.
That's right.
He's relational by nature, and so they're wired that way. And so I think it's an exciting time for me. I see that as transparency, authenticity, all these things lend to who Christ is,
yes,
who we're called to be.
Good.
And so we don't have to put up a front. And if we put up a front and we try and be cool, kids don't need cool. I mean, I get cool, and yeah, they like cool initially, but they want caring. On our youth team, we have many leaders for our youth kids and small group leaders, and they range from, we have a woman in her mid-70s, I think it's her early 70s, mid-70s. We're diverse all the way to just out of high school.
Yeah.
And we have men and women, and we have grandparent figures and parent figures and aunt uncle figures, and they need that because culturally the family is broken, and all those relationships that they're longing for that they don't have, I believe we can provide. And so I know that might not be easy for small churches to provide that, but I think they can build that way. I think that's a goal line.
Couldn't a small church in some ways even provide that better than a big church?
I think in some ways, yes. I mean, there's always strategies to make big church small, no matter how, whether you're a big church. But yeah, the small church is at an initial advantage.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because they can do that easy. Maybe because they're already in that situation that feels kind of comfortable and not overwhelming. Because I know, you look around and you see familiar faces all the time, so it doesn't feel like,
and genuine relationship because they can genuinely care for them.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Really good.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it. That's just another small church minute. Hopefully it was helpful to you.